evening. In this sketch, or series rather, sub-series, we will attempt to outline some concepts related to Marxism. And this, to be clear, is in no way intended to be a summary of Marx's major works, Das Kapital, Critique of Political Economy. Das Kapital is a monster of 3 books, each of 800 pages. However, Marxism is a puzzling concept, to the point that Marx himself, after hearing of how some of his ideas were misinterpreted, said famously, "I am not a Marxist." More in general, everybody has an idea of what Marxism is, and most of what is known comes from random discussions, Hollywood movies, television, or newspapers. We have therefore a situation where some or many believe they know enough about Marxism to draw their usually negative conclusions, while others think that the subject is too fuzzy or irrelevant for wasting much time about it. In this video, or videos, I will merely introduce some of the fundamental concepts on which the economical and sociological structure of Marxism is founded. Concepts that seem to suggest something mysterious or arcane, such, for example, dialectical materialism. How in heaven, can materialism be dialectical? It has nothing to do with dialogues or dialects. It simply means that society and economy are phenomena that never stand still. The best analogy I can think of is of a movie made up of frames succeeding each other fast enough to give the appearance of motion. But each of the frames is not a movie. Using this analogy, a static economic theory is obsolete the moment it is finished, as it is the equivalent of one single frame in a movie. In its simple description, we can say, Marxism is a scientific theory of how society works and how capitalism works. The Marxist analysis is not based on abstract or static notions, but rather on accurate and detailed observations and inductions. Marxist analysis is not similar to philosophic theories, for example. Rather, Marxism is constantly developed, and its tools of analysis enable to apply a scientific approach to new relevant facts and developments. The idea behind the scientific approach is that additional analytical knowledge acquired about society can be applied to change the external world we live in. Marxism is important because its theories are developed from facts, not from preconceptions or dogmas. And when theories agree with facts, those theories, you may agree, are usually true. To draw some benefit from this presentation, I hope, I will invite the viewers to avoid associating instinctively Marxism with any of the current or past radical communist or anarchist movement or parties. Such association only confusion. And one more word of caution. In attempting to extract the essential from a massive scientific work, the essential must be simple to be hopefully of any practical use. Therefore, it may be natural for some of our viewers during the video to say to themselves, "I knew this already." But the general idea is that having a foundation on any theory or science means possessing some basic mental infrastructure that pulls and ties various individual notions together into a whole. Once the infrastructure is in place, it is easier to delve more deeply into the scientific theory of any scientific theory, or here scientific theory of society. Marxism is a science of history, focusing on economy, but simultaneously dealing with people. For example, Cromwell, the prime mover of the English Civil War in 1640, is a milestone character in the mix of history and economy, for it was through that civil war that feudalism was conclusively defeated to leave room for the unfettered explosion of capitalism. Marxistically speaking, the study of the changes in the economy, production and distribution of that period are symbiotically associated and concurrent with the English Civil War. The idea applicable to the Civil War and to other historical evolutions is that the laws derived by a Marxian analysis are applicable to the development of society and are as factual as the laws of any other science. to determine the laws of economic history, it is necessary not to look at individuals but to peoples. And one of the first discoveries is that different sections of people in a society pull in one direction and other, roughly speaking, in another or opposite direction. And these sections of people constitute the classes. In the crudest simplification, what makes a class is a number of people who make their living in the same way. For example, during the feudalism, the king and the lords lived thanks to the tributes exacted from the serfs, the producer of things, mainly agriculture. The feudal class wanted to extract as much as possible from the serfs wanted to retain, of course, as much as possible. This is the most easily understandable form of class struggle, which is at the base of all economic history. There were class wars all over Europe in the Middle Ages, all unsuccessful and forgotten by all except by specialized historians. Mainly with the growth of the city-states, markets were centralized and impetus was given to production intended not just as a tribute to the feudal lord, but for local consumption and markets. In turn, and with time, there rose two different classes: the independent artisans and those who work for them for wages. And starting around the 16th century, an industrial capitalist class developed, and its counterpart, the industrial working class. A shadow phenomenon occurred in the countryside, with on the one hand the growth of the capitalist farmer class and the farm laborer earning wages. The serfs who had escaped from the manor to the town, we could say, did not pay any longer a tribute, of course, but those ex-serfs who gained some form of economic independence were soon forced to pay all sorts of taxes and were subject to a range of restrictions, tolls, duties, and so on. How could kings and nobles do this? Simple. Because they owned and controlled the machinery of state, the judges, the prisons, the soldiers, and of course the laws. Therefore, the class struggle now pitted the new capitalist class against the established monarchical feudal system. The bubble erupted in the 17th century with the English Civil War, as I said, and with what was euphemistically called the Glorious Revolution of 1688, that put limits to the power of the king. Taking the Glorious Revolution as one instance of a Marxist analysis, canonical history books depict the revolution as a religious and moral struggle between a despotic king and Cromwell, representing the ideals of British freedom. But which of these two explanations is correct? The capitalistic, if you like, or the religious moral? The answer is that they both are. And the essence of a Marxist analysis is to consider them as a whole that can be analyzed but not separated. Or rather, the event in its totality acquires a coherent sense in the context of the class struggle. A similar notion applies to the analysis of any other historical moment. There is a sentence that I think is particularly meaningful in this regard. Just as we cannot judge an individual on the basis of his own opinion of himself, so a revolutionary period cannot be judged from his own consciousness. Move time forward to our own days. The revolutions in reverse, exemplified by the invasion and literal destruction of several states such as Iraq, Libya, Syria, and others, and the fomented upheavals in various other countries can hardly be judged on the basis of a presumed export of democracy. That is, we cannot judge the US foreign policies on the basis of its own consciousness. In the instance, such events and invasions can only be analyzed on the basis of a confluence between class struggle and imperialism. The two are always close and never far apart. But if the core of history is the class struggle, and if the class struggle arises from changes in the mode of production, then it follows that the division of society into classes and the rise of new classes depends on the development and the evolution of the productive forces which, in turn, make the product we live by. Therefore, When power-driven machinery took over traditional man-powered occupations, two new classes arose: the capitalist class, who owned the power-driven machinery but did not work, and the industrial working class that did not own the means of production but worked. This change came naturally, almost unconsciously. But increased knowledge embodied in the new means of production also caused profound social changes. And these changes prompted class conflict over ideas, institutions, religion, justice, you name it. Why? And this is another important Marxist point. The conflicts arose and arise because the idea and institution current at the time of the new conflict rested on conditions reflecting all modes of production and class relations. Another myth about Marxism is that it is an ideology based on abstract and utopic principles, and this is incorrect. For Marxism, so-called principles are ideas that hold good at any particular time, but do not necessarily mean the same thing for everyone. And even if they did mean the same thing at one time in history, the same ideas means something different in different historical times. Example, take the concept of equality. Most of us know or remember the famous words of the Declaration of Independence: all men are created equal, etc., etc. Except blacks, who were not considered human, Native Americans, because they were not European, women, because they were not men, and the poor, of course, because they were not rich. Or take liberty, equality, and fraternity, the motto of the French Revolution. What it really meant, and subsequent events proved it, it meant that the liberty for the expanding capitalist class to trade without restriction, the equality, it meant that what it meant, the equality of the capitalist class with the nobility and the remnants of the feudal lords, and the fraternity of this class with itself. None of this applied to the French colonies, for example, or actually it did. In fact, a black representative from Haiti, I believe, was part of the National Assembly sometimes in the 1790s. But with the advent of Napoleon, the whole project of equality was squashed, and the representatives of the colony went the way of all flesh. To the point that the French Revolution started with the idea that everything was bad with kings and nobility, but there was nothing wrong with an emperor. So much for consistency. From the Marxist analysis point of view, it means that the ideas that guide the organization of society are class ideas, or rather, the ideas of the dominant class. Those ideas, the dominant class can impose on the rest of society via, as you know, the ownership of the media and means of propaganda, the schools, and the justice system. However, and this is important, it does not mean that the dominant class says, oh, here is an idea which is not true, or we will force it, for we will force all the people to believe it and make sure that they do not deny it, at least in public. These ideas developed from actual life and in a way that we cannot explain. For example, some of you have seen the series Downton Abbey. In the series, explained the fact that during the early 20th century, American robber barons typically used to send their daughters to England to marry an English lord. The operation had been dubbed cash for title. There was no written or imposed agenda stating that noblemen are or were superior to other people. But in this, as in other similar cases, once the idea is established, it is important for the dominant class to make sure that everybody accepts it. And the dominant class prevents, with all the means at its disposal, including sometimes death, the spread of dangerous thought. But, as I said before, the prime movers for societal changes are not dangerous thought. Rather, it is from a change or an advance in the form of production that dangerous thoughts are arising directly. And the dangerous thought arises from the conflict between the old and the new conditions and forms of production. Generally speaking, the ideas based on the old system of production are conservatives, they are a brake on men's action, and it follows that the dominant class in each period strives to teach and maintain these ideas. Ideas based on the new condition of productions are progressive and that is why the dominant class considers them dangerous. And from these conflicts arises the Marxist idea of social development called historical materialism. Important. This label, as other similar labels, has been used to label Marxism as a materialistic philosophy, meaning that it denies the life of the spirit and, by extension, the God of various religions. This is a complete misrepresentation. Very few, if any, will deny that man's actions are determined by the material world about him. It is because we are hungry that we look at the material world around us and decide to either go to a restaurant or to a store to buy groceries. More in general, we experience the material world not in the abstract, but while dealing with the production and the products we need for our life. As knowledge increases and new forms of production are invented, the old forms of social organization become a barrier to new developments. The class at the receiving end of the conflict becomes aware of this from its actual experience of life. It fights against those barriers deriving from the established forms of organization represented usually by the ruling class. Note that in this very schematic representation of the class struggle, the role of exploitation or of who is exploiting whom is almost irrelevant. In the fight between the feudal lords against the rising merchant and soon-to-be capitalist class, the established laws and conventions with the extant tributes, obligations, duties, restrictions, obligations by vassals to lords, were restrictions on trade, and by making trade difficult, they restricted manufacturing. The situation evolved into a class war against the ruling feudal class in order to change the system. And at the end of the 15th century, to stick to this example, feudalism as we know it from history books was finished, opening the way to the centralized states of Western Europe. Now, Marx began with the study of British history. After all, he had been expelled from Germany and France for his dangerous ideas. Based on his analysis of history, he set himself up to discover what could be called the law of motion of capitalist society. If a law of motion could be discovered for society, it could predict how and why the capitalist methods would change with the developments of new modes of production. And the idea or procedure of analysis was, in this case, fundamentally new. Why? Other famous thinkers, for example Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Frenchmen such as Proudhon, Fourier, etc., had written extensively about capitalism. But the result of their studies was a static system, a description, but not a prescription or a forecast of things to come at large. Marx, instead, wanted to provide not just a description, but a scientific forecast using the original tools that he discovered. We can only touch the surface with our historical studies, sketches, but even so, I hope that these notions may be sufficient to dispel some preconceptions. As mentioned, the class struggle between feudalism and incipient capitalism ended with the victory of capitalism, or said it another way, the noble lords of the manors had to make room for the ignoble, or at least not so noble merchants and manufacturers, the new capitalists. And what is the difference between a feudal and a capitalistic form of production? The difference is profit. For the mark of capitalism is production of profit. The reason why profit has got a bad name in left-wing quarters especially, and why the term profit for many suggests exploitation, is not due to the idea of profit per se, but to another concept usually not associated with profit, namely monopolies, of which we can talk about now. Let's remain with the main theme. To produce something for profit, two things are needed. First, someone must have sufficient means to buy machinery to establish some kind of production process. And second, there must be people who do not own the means of production. This is obvious. That is, there must be capitalists and workers. Unlike the feudal system, the workers now produce goods for their new lords, the capitalists, not for the personal use of the capitalist, but for the capitalist to sell for money. And this is an important concept. Marx defines all things to be sold for money as commodities. The worker receives wages, the employer receives profit, that is what is left after the customer pays for the finished product and the capitalist pays the wages. Again, this seems so intuitive as to be ridiculous to say it. But here Marx introduces one of those mental wrenches that prompt us not to take things for what they seem. If the capitalists sell items for profit, what or where is the source of the profit? It cannot be because the capitalist sells the products above their value, because if it were so, think about it, it would mean that all capitalists are cheating each other. Some would gain, some would lose, but profit and losses would cancel themselves out. The answer to this dilemma is that the value of an article for sale must already contain in itself the profit. Or said it another way, the profit is born during production and not during the sale of the product, which is counterintuitive. But what is that during production adds to the product greater value than its actual cost? We cannot answer the question, says Marx, unless we determine what we mean by value. Now, there are two meanings of value. One is use. Something represents value to me because I use it. A beer after a long jog in the sun is value to me, or an inconspicuous item dear to me but to no other may have a sentimental value or similar. This is use value. But in common parlance, when we think of value, we refer to the value of things on sale, how much we have to pay for them. And to distinguish this from use value, Marx defined it as exchange value. But now another question arises: what gives an item more exchange value than another? Or rather, is there something common to all items endowed with an exchange value so that the comparison may be possible? There is only one property common to all products. They are produced, and to be produced they require, of course, human labor. The conclusion of this is that a product has more exchange value in proportion to the human labor spent on its production. And this refers not so much to the individual labor time, but to the average labor time, which Marx called the average socially necessary labor time required for its production. Before defining this average socially necessary labor time, we must address another question. What determines the amount of wages paid to the workers? We know that what is involved in the interaction between capitalism and labor, interaction aimed at determining the exchange value of a product, what is involved is the labor time spent in producing the particular product. But what is the labor time spent in producing labor power, as opposed to time spent, say, in reading, watching TV, or any other leisure activity? And this labor time is the time spent in producing the food, the clothing, the housing, and other necessary things to keep a worker alive while he is employed. In other words, the labor time needed to keep the worker and possibly his family alive determines the exchange value of the worker's labor power, which is held to the capitalist for wages. You have to think, maybe read this twice, see it twice. In current capitalist society, the time spent in maintaining the worker's labor power, that is, in keeping him fed and alive, may be, say, for sake of example, 4 hours, whereas his labor time may be 8 or 10 hours or more, meaning that for the first 4 hours he produces the equivalent of what is paid to him in wages in order to remain alive. For the remaining hours he produces what Marx calls surplus value, which goes to the employer. And here is the important conclusion. The source of capitalist profit is what the worker produces beyond what is necessary to keep him alive, that is, the wages he receives. And let's stop here so that we can digest the idea that the wages are actually the profit inside the exchange value of a product. Let's recall the main items we covered so far. Ideas for production derived from material needs, an obvious truth that confers the adjective of materialistic to the Marxist analysis. Why materialism is called dialectical? Because it is constantly changing. Evolutions in the modes of production give rise to the class struggle. Capitalism is born when items are not exchanged or bartered, but when they are sold for profit. The profit in an item sold is the wage paid to the workers over and above what is necessary to keep them alive. In the next episode, we will extend these concepts and explore their implication. There's a lot of information. Some of it you may have to see it again or check it online on my site. But until then, thank you for watching. I am Jimmy Moglia for Historical Sketches. Good night.